Train cars like this one were used to transport irradiated meat after the disaster. During the liquidation of the Chernobyl site, all livestock and wild animals within the exclusion zone were culled to prevent the spread of radioactive meat. When irradiated meat appeared in Moscow stores, the Soviet health minister raised the alarm and halted sales of meat from the exclusion zone. However, the Moscow party bosses ensured their own supply was safe to eat. In the Soviet Union of 1986, meat was still not accessible or affordable for common folk. Beef was especially scarce. The idea of throwing away thousands of tons of expensive food was something party bosses disliked. A protocol was developed to cleanse the meat of radioactivity to make it edible. Processing plants were instructed to soak the meat in chemically treated water, then check radioactivity levels. It didn't help that the plants had to expedite the process due to the huge surplus of meat. This resulted in inaccurate assessments of radioactivity and the mixing of safe and highly irradiated meat. In 1987, over 300 tons of frozen meat was shipped to the Georgian Socialist Republic, but was rejected after being tested by a dosimetrist. The meat was then loaded on a train and caused fear and panic wherever it traveled. The local authorities in Ovruch asked for the meat to be buried, but their request was rejected. The train was then sent to the Ukrainian village of Polotsk, pasted with warning signs and locked up. The radioactive meat remained there until the generator for the refrigeration failed, and the local electricians refused to repair it.
The issue was brought to the public's attention by reporters who took photos of the radioactive train.
KGB agents eventually buried the meat in South Belarus in a concrete-lined pit. The Chernobyl NPP shelter structure, also known as the sarcophagus, is a large concrete and steel dome that covers the damaged Reactor 4 building. The sarcophagus was built to contain radioactive materials following the 1986 disaster and to protect the environment from further contamination. However, due to deterioration, a new structure called the New Safe Confinement was built and completed in 2016. The sarcophagus contained 200 tons of radioactive corium, 30 tons of dangerously contaminated dust, and 16 tons of uranium and plutonium. The Russian name for the structure, Obyekt Ukryte, means covering. The design of the original sarcophagus started on May 20, 1986. Construction took 206 days and involved 8 stages, including clearing the area and laying concrete around Reactor 4. Erecting protective walls, covering the turbine hull, and installing a ventilation system. The construction used over 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,300 tons of metal framework. It resulted in the enclosure of 740,000 cubic meters of heavily contaminated debris and soil. The New Safe Confinement, also known as the New Shelter or ORCA, is a structure erected in 2016 at the Chernobyl NPP. It also covers the temporary shelter sarcophagus that was built shortly after the disaster. The main objective of the New Safe Confinement is to protect the reactor from external elements, facilitate its decommission, and keep water from seeping in. It's a major project that forms part of the shelter implementation plan. which is supported by the Chernobyl Shelter Fund. Its goal is to contain the radioactive remains for a minimum of 100 years and to dismantle the original sarcophagus that was hastily built by the liquidators. The structure was designed and constructed by the French consortium Novaca, along with Vinci Construction Grants Projects and Bouygues Travaux Publics. Funding was sourced from the Chernobyl Shelter Fund, overseen by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. 46 countries and organizations contributed to the fund, including the EBRD itself. The cost of the new safe confinement exceeded 2 billion euros. The reactor meltdown at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was a catastrophic event that occurred on April 26, 1986. It resulted in the release of significant amounts of radioactive materials into the environment. The meltdown occurred during a safety test when one of the reactors at the plant overheated and the fuel rods in the reactor core ruptured. This ignited a fire that released large amounts of radioactive materials into the atmosphere. The explosion and subsequent fire destroyed the reactor and the roof of the building. It sent a plume of radioactive smoke and dust into the air that spread over large parts of Europe. Later on, a special containment structure called a sarcophagus was created to stop the spread of radionuclides. All in all, the disaster caused widespread environmental contamination and led to the evacuation of over 100,000 people from the surrounding area. The explosion and subsequent fire destroyed much of the reactor and the roof of the building. However, remnants of the reactor were eventually encased in a massive concrete structure known as the sarcophagus. It was built to contain the remaining radioactive materials and prevent further spread of contamination. The sarcophagus was built over the course of several months. Over 600,000 workers were involved in the effort. In recent years, a new containment structure known as the New Safe Confinement, or ARCA, has been built over the sarcophagus. This new structure was needed to better contain and protect against the spread of radioactive materials. While the reactor itself was severely damaged and is no longer in operation, much of the radioactive material remains at the site. The Chernobyl disaster was caused by a combination of factors, including design flaws in the reactor, operator error, and an inadequate safety culture. However, several Soviet officials were charged with negligence, including Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. Several other individuals were also charged, including Shift Supervisor Boris Rogozhin and the head of the power plant, Viktor Bryukhanov. On the night of April 25-26, 1986, prior to a scheduled maintenance shutdown, Soviet technicians conducted a turbine test on Unit 4 of the Chernobyl NPP. They mistakenly disabled the emergency cooling system and other important safety protocols to perform the test. A series of errors caused a buildup of steam, which led to the reactor overheating. At 1:23 a.m., two powerful explosions ruptured the steel and concrete lid and sent a fireball into the sky, releasing a large amount of radioactive material. The situation was made worse by the subsequent outbreak of several fires, including one inside the reactor core that lasted for 10 days. The Chernobyl disaster released a minimum of 100 times more radiation than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These gigantic structures are the cooling towers for reactors 5 and 6 at the Chernobyl NPP. They were built as part of a planned expansion of the facility. Construction of these reactors began in the early 1980s, but was halted following the explosion and subsequent disaster at Reactor 4 in 1986. Cooling towers are commonly used in thermal and nuclear power plants to cool large amounts of water using atmospheric airflow. Water used to reduce heat generated by the nuclear reaction must be cooled to prevent the fuel from overheating and causing a meltdown. Coolant water is pumped through the reactor to a heat exchanger, where the heat is transferred to a separate water circuit flowing to the cooling tower. The hot water is sprayed into the tower and exposed to the air, which cools the water through evaporation. Cooled water is then reused in the heat exchanger, repeating the process, while warm air from the cooling tower is released into the atmosphere. The towers are 150 meters tall and 126 meters in diameter. They're made of reinforced concrete. Unit 5 and its tower were still under construction in 1986 when the disaster occurred, halting all work. Priorities later shifted to constructing the shelter for the destroyed Unit 4, and the new reactors and towers were abandoned. Nowadays, the Chernobyl towers and their artificial islands surrounded by a channel are a popular tourist attraction. On the 30th anniversary of the disaster, an Australian artist painted a mural inside the 110-meter tower, using a 1986 photograph by photojournalist Igor Kostin. Soviet authorities attempted to cover up the extent of the Chernobyl disaster. The Soviet government downplayed the severity of the incident and initially reported only 2 deaths and a few more injured. They also tried to keep the details of the incident secret, with only limited information released to the public. No, the international community soon realized the gravity of the situation as radioactive particles were detected in other countries. This led to increased international pressure to release information. Further information was only made public after increased radiation levels were detected in Sweden, which prompted the Swedish government to alert other European countries. Thus, the Soviet government was forced to acknowledge the incident and its disastrous consequences. Despite the risks, many people in the region, including plant workers, firefighters, liquidators, and doctors, chose to speak out. They revealed the severity of the disaster and the inadequate response of Soviet authorities. This helped spark greater international attention and support, which ultimately led to a more effective response and better aid.